I'm surprised I have to make this distinction, but this has nothing to do with the MIT study performed on Oreos because that had to do with the patterns observed when twisting the cookie open, and I'm concerned with actually biting the cookie. So I was eating some unnamed chocolate sandwich cookies like any ordinary person, and as you already know, there's the right way to eat them and the wrong way to eat them. But I like to indulge in a bit of sin every once in a while. I noticed that eating the cookies the wrong way resulted in a messier bite and some unusual fracture patterns. So here's what I think I found. Now there's a lot of ways the cookie can physically fracture when you bite it, so it can seem almost random, but I think the cookies actually obey some fairly simple physics. First, we'll be assuming you hold the cookie by pinching the top and bottom because that's the way I eat them, and I think it produces more interesting patterns that way. Okay, so this is probably going to be the most boring part of the video because I'm just going to be scribbling over a bunch of pictures of Oreos and talking about some boring old engineering blah 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 stuff. But basically the simplest case is we're going to have our front teeth over here, not our incisors, just the front teeth, and we're going to be biting down on the cookie. And obviously we're going to have our finger pressing down on the cookie over here. We're also going to have our finger and teeth from the bottom pushing up on the cookie, but since we're only looking at the top face, I'm just going to ignore those for now. And this combination of forces is going to generate this fracture line over here. It's kind of straight, but not really, because of these structures over here. What these structures do is they increase the thickness of the cookie in those areas, meaning the cookie is a lot stiffer in those areas. Meaning the fracture line is going to try to avoid those areas because it doesn't have enough energy to break them. That's how fractures work. They break through the weakest point of the material. And to kind of illustrate what happens, when you press down on the cookie over here, this part of the cream is going to compress. That's because the cream is going to be what I'm going to call pseudo-compressible because that sounds fancy. The cream basically only compresses when you apply a high enough force. And whenever you bite down on the cookie, that's going to give you a high enough force to compress the cream. So when that part of the cream compresses, your cookie's basically just going to rotate a little bit into the cream. And what that basically looks like is essentially this part over here is going to act as a pivot point. And technically there's a lot of more complicated stuff that happens, like the adhesive forces of the cream that act as a distributed load or whatever. But the most important thing here is that we have an upward force over here, a downward force over here from your finger, and a downward force over here from you biting, which is going to cause some bending stresses over here. And then this part over here is going to have a really high internal stress and it's going to fracture. Now this example is slightly more complicated because we have two broken off pieces of cookie. That's because for this one, I actually used my incisors in the bite, which I had around over here and over here. Or actually over here. And over here. And then I had my finger over here. And then if we look back to our first example, the fracture line was basically perpendicular to the line connecting the finger and the teeth, basically. So if we imagine a line between the finger and the teeth, the fracture line is just going to run perpendicular to that. And obviously the fracture is still happening between these structures over here, because as I mentioned earlier, the structures add stiffness to the cookie, so the cookie has to fracture around the parts without the structures. And then if you were to continue your bite, the cookie might look something like this. Obviously this isn't the same cookie. I forgot to actually bite through the last cookie, so I had to get a different one. In this cookie, I had my incisors over here and over here, and I had my finger over here. And we have our fracture lines running perpendicular to the line between the finger and the teeth, as usual. Except this time, they kind of met in the middle over here, so they just formed one straight line down here. And then when you bite through the cookie, you're just going to trace the outline of your teeth like that. And that happened to form 5 different fracture sites, or pieces, I guess, over here. And as you can still tell, the initial fractures still happen along these structures over here, but since you're biting down with more force along your teeth outline, this can just break through any structures if there happen to be any. So basically, to summarize, your incisors break off these parts first. Then when you bite down on the cookie, you break off these additional parts, which is why we get 5 different pieces. But sometimes you get really flimsy cookies. So I had my incisors over here and over here, and I had my finger over here actually. I forgot to take a picture while I was holding the cookie. And because the cookie was really fragile, the fracture line actually happened over here from my right incisor, which isn't perpendicular, but because the cookie was fragile, it just broke over there. It did still break around these fractures over here. Like, that's not going to change. I mean, I guess it kind of broke through the E a little bit, but for the most part, it just broke around the structures. And you can obviously just trace my bite through, and we get 3 different pieces of cookie. Sorry if it was really hard to listen to that part of the video. I did it without a script, so I ended up saying a lot, and I didn't really know what I was talking about. But you can probably repeat this methodology and thinking to understand different fracture patterns for different people eating chocolate sandwich cookies. And of course, twisting the cookie open and licking the cream off first is the best way to consume the cookie for 2 reasons. Your saliva changes the material property, making fracture less likely to propagate uncontrollably, and resulting in a cleaner bite. And also, there is no more unnecessary bending moment from biting into the cookie, making it easier to bite into.